Hey everybody, welcome to the Blendr Report, where news meets rational thinking. I'm your host, Jonathan Harvey, and this is your co-host, Liam DeBoer. What are we talking about today, pal?
Today, we're going to be chatting about Trump hitting the ground running with a flurry of executive action signaling sweeping policy changes, Trump eyeing February 1st for the start of 25% tariffs on Mexico and Canada, Mark Carney officially announcing he's running for Liberal leadership, Chrystia Freeland's authoritarian overreach during the Freedom Convoy being exposed, Canada's EV mandate facing a reality check as subsidies disappear, and a judge agreeing to expedite the legal challenge of Trudeau's move to prorogue Parliament. All right, let's get started. All right, first off, we've got Trump hits the ground running with a flurry of executive action signaling sweeping policy changes. President Donald Trump began his new term with 200 executive actions, marking the most aggressive policy shift in modern U.S. history. He pardoned 1,500 individuals from January 6th cases, including Enrico Tarrio, and overhauled federal agencies with hiring freezes and mandates to end government censorship. Immigration reforms included reinstating the border wall construction, ending birthright citizenship, and designating cartels as terrorist organizations. Economic directives prioritized energy independence. He withdrew the U.S. from the Paris Agreement and WHO and rolled back electric vehicle mandates. Trump also abolished diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI programs, as well as redefining gender policies. These actions underscore a transformative America First agenda. So which of these executive actions do you like best, and do you think any went too far?
Interesting question. I like the idea of putting the cartels into a terrorist group. I think that that's actually pretty key. They've been running rampant through the United States and Canada for quite some time, and they're helping China with a lot of this fentanyl nonsense, which is causing the death of about 100,000 lives every year. It curtailed a little bit this year, but that's just between Canada and the US. So I'm a fan of that. They're violent. Like what they cut each other's heads off at scale, right? So it's a violent group of people. And I think it's important to sort of reset a foundation of like authority within the country that you're not accepting this anymore. And I think it has to do like with the wild immigration as well. And with the open borders, I don't think any of that's helping. So we'll see how that kind of plays out. The DEI, yeah, goodbye. This thing makes no sense. It should have been gone long ago. Same with the gender stuff. Some people will say, hey, these are good things, or hey, the government shouldn't be intervening. But the thing is, this is actually a rollback on policies that they did implement that they shouldn't be involved in. It's kind of like, let me put it this way. You can do whatever you want. You can call yourself whatever you want. I don't care. But this shouldn't be government mandated. Just like if you are religious and you like to go to church, you should be able to do your thing. I have nothing against what your religion you're a part of. I don't care. But there should be a separation between church and state. And it's my opinion. I know this may be a bit of a leap for some people, but that's how I see a lot of this gender nonsense anyway. I see it very similar to what has become a religion, right? With respect to the WHO and the Paris Agreement, totally on board, right? I think the WHO has just been in a significant power grab mode for a very long time. They're manufacturing, in my opinion, they're manufacturing crises to give themselves something to do. I don't necessarily think that they're the ones spreading disease. That's not what I'm saying. But like 7 people get bird flu, and they're like, pandemic. And it's just like, it doesn't make any sense. So for me, I think that they're always looking for a reason to say, hey, we need more money for X, whatever it may be. Even if like there was something in Africa not that long ago, a disease that was going in the right direction. So it was becoming more transmissible, but less deadly. This is what you want. And these numbers were like year over year numbers, but they still decided to declare, I believe, an endemic given the location was specific. But they needed another $60 million to fight this crisis, right? And that's one thing. But the other thing, which I think is really egregious with the WHO, is the pandemic treaty that they're pushing, which gives them sweeping global powers. We have to stop ceding power to these organizations. With the Paris Agreement too, like, look, the climate science is not clear. It's not clear. The climate is always changing, and we are contributing to it in some fashion. But I don't think it's very significant, the amount that we are actually contributing to the deterioration, if it even is deteriorating. Carbon, there was some things that have come up the other day. First of all, carbon is crucial for plant life. And something else that happened, and this was interesting to me because I did a video on the impact of forests in Canada and how much carbon, I think we're actually better than carbon neutral. I said, even if my numbers are up by 90%, I'm still correct. A report came out in October that just came to light now that they undervalued the ability of forests to consume carbon by 31%. So again, like you kind of look at these figures and you're like, okay, maybe the climate change issue is not quite that significant. When you look at the science, I would suggest that's the case. They've also got no agreed way of measuring the 1.5 degree temperature rise for the Paris Agreement, which is insane to me. You look at some of the stuff, though, is economic policies. I like his cheap energy policy because at the end of the day, that's how you improve the lives for Americans. Cheap energy, as you know, is the foundation of every strong economy. Right now, anyway. So with things being focused on this more, green energy and more expensive stuff and not doing enough stuff at home, it's harder for their economy to sort of thrive. So I think the energy thing will actually help economics at scale in the country. And finally, I would say what is the most divisive, other than the gender nonsense, is the January 6th pardons. So his ratings went down a good chunk.
Oh, really?
After doing that. Yeah, he's down to 47%. I think polls are polls, and you can ask whoever you want, so take that with a grain of salt for sure. But yeah, it seemed like a divisive move. A lot of people weren't a huge fan of it. Personally, though, I have no issue with it. I think because these were non-violent people. They weren't just they were just people that were there, and maybe they shouldn't have been. And there's an argument to be had about that whole thing. When you look at groups that have occupied Capitol Hill, there's a bunch of Democrats that have done it that were fighting for. I think it was a pro-Palestinian thing. A couple of years ago, and they didn't throw any of those people in jail. So I think it's a bit of a double standard here for these 1,500 people. Maybe the most divisive would be the Enrico Tarrio guy. He was the mastermind behind Jan 6, which he was not. He was definitely part of the Proud Boys, and I'm sure the guy's done a lot of things that are less than desirable, for sure. But he wasn't even in the state when the January 6th riots happened. So I don't think he should be in jail for 22 years like they sentenced him. I think that's insane. That's my thought. So yeah, I think that's the most divisive, but I think the other big thing which we'll see come up in the next month or so is the tariffs. I think those are going to be a bit of a problem.
Well, yeah, we'll get into that story next for sure. The interesting thing, though, that I've seen happen from this is you are seeing the Overton window shift. So, for instance, Michael Schellenberger actually made a really good point that the fact that you're not seeing mass protests or anything of that nature against Trump and even the moves he's making, again, like you pointed out, the DEI stuff or the January 6th stuff is divisive, but people aren't really acting upon that. Where we saw that in 2016, right? They were like, what was that? What, the one where all the women wore the pussy hats on the street? There was like a million of them. But that was a lot of them. Or the memes, or too, like even those classic memes you see of like people throwing themselves in the street crying and all of this kind of stuff. I'm sure there's still a few TikTok videos here. But as far as like public movements, you're not really seeing any of that. So Schellenberger made a good point that he didn't just beat them in the election, but he's beat them morally. And this is one of those things that I was pointing out in a prior episode, which is that when it comes to Trump, a lot of the things that he says, they spread, like the idea spreads like wildfire. So for instance, 2 or 3 months ago, before Trump said that the whole Canada 51st state thing, that wasn't even a thought in anybody's mind.
No.
In 99% of Americans' minds and 99% of Canadians' minds, nobody was thinking these two countries could merge. Him just with one tweet all of a sudden sent that into the zeitgeist where people are like actually real in life responding to that potential reality coming true. But where I'm going with that is you're seeing all this other stuff come, all these other topics now with the bold moves that he's made as soon as he's got in. So for instance, the gender ideology stuff. People have criticized guys like Pierre Poilievre for not being as hard on the gender activism as they think he should be. I often see that critique of him online, or that he skirts around that answer and tries to kind of placate and doesn't give hard answers. But we just saw him do the exact opposite now after being asked that question after Trump made the whole gender move.
First, stay on the job. President Trump signed an executive order, the U.S. government only recognizing two genders, male, female. They're unchangeable. If elected as prime minister, is that something that you're going to kind of walk in line with, or what are your feelings on that executive order?
Well, I don't know. Do you have any other genders that you'd like to name?
Me personally?
Good answer.
Yes.
I'm just asking more so if you're in line with what he is saying. Do you agree with what he's saying? Is that something that you would be lockstep with if elected as prime minister?
Well, I'm not aware of any other genders than men and women. I mean, if you have any other that you want me to consider, you're welcome to tell me right now.
Well, there's personally, I am a man. I am as
Okay.
people say cis man.
Okay.
There are people there who, they say they're
Me too. I'm
gender
a man.
neutral.
Well,
you are a man. Yes. There are people there who say they're
something in
gender
common.
neutral. Yeah. They say they're gender neutral. They're a trans person. Is that something that you would recognize here? Whereas in the States, at least with their U.S. government, the way they're seeing it, there's only two.
I'm only aware of two, but I mean, if you come up with another list, then you're welcome to do that. But I'm aware of two, and as far as I'm concerned, we should have a government that just minds its own damn business and leaves people alone.
Minds its own damn business and leaves people alone. That's exactly what this is about.
So that's a very long-winded way of me explaining that. Just these moves that Trump has made to begin have just shifted the Overton window to now the point that when Poilievre is being asked that question, he's almost making the interviewer look, well, he is. He's making the interviewer look stupid for even trying to make a thing out of it. Just being like, are we still on about this nonsense?
Yeah.
And so it just cuts through that. And so I think that was a big takeaway from the first day, is that you're just seeing an Overton window shift. Actually, maybe the last thing we should touch on before moving on here is the whole Elon salute craziness. I will say, like, obviously, okay, so the whole story is, he gave two things which appeared to be a Nazi salute at his speech after the inauguration. But if you go look at the full clip, he says right after, where it gets conveniently cut for all of the media outlets, right afterwards, he says, "My heart goes out to you."
Well, this is like something like that. Like you tap your chest, your heart, and you like put your hand up. Like I'm going to smash into things if I do it. And also I don't really need to do a Nazi salute today. But that's like something from like the 80s and 90s. That's common. Like that is a very common thing people do. Like, yo, what's up? Like that is common shit.
Well,
obviously it's lost its relevance in today's society. Elon's not relevant. He's on the spectrum. So for me, it's just ridiculous.
Well, it's not as clear cut as just say bumping the chest and throwing the peace sign out. Like it looked like even when I saw the clip at first, I was like, "Yo, that's a bad look."
I saw it too, but it's 100%. As soon as I saw it, I was like, because I was like, "What is this about? Is he just fucking with people?" I was like, either way, not a good move. But when you said that they cut that after, when you told me what he had said after they cut it, I was like, "Oh, I totally understand. These people are just terrible."
The funny thing about this whole scandal, I guess you would call it, is that a week ago he was on the exact other side with getting shit from, say, the far right side of the actual, well, they really are. Like, there's some crazy people on Twitter for sure. But they were going after Elon for being pro-Israel and were like calling him an Israel cuck and all of this kind of stuff. And maybe he's a little soft on them. I don't know. I haven't paid too much attention to it. But 1 week, you're in a scandal for being an Israeli cuck.
Yes.
And the next week with the far right, and then the next week with the far left, you're a Nazi. You're Nazi. It's just,
you can't win. It's okay. Like I think what's interesting though is that this kind of stuff has happened at such a high volume now that I always take it all with such a very, very big grain of salt. Like nothing gets me anymore. You've just seen it happen so many times, and every side does whatever they can to look for a confirmation bias or to knock someone down a peg, regardless of whether it's jealousy or just for their own ideology or agenda. It just happens all the time. So when I see this stuff, I'm always like, all right, this is isolated. It looks kind of fucked up, but why don't I figure out what's actually happening here? 9 times out of 10, it's nothing. It's nonsense. It's just a skewed version of reality.
Yeah. And actually this goes both ways though. And
100%.
This is something that, I think a long time ago, I maybe would have fallen guilty for doing similar things where you kind of like pick on low hanging fruit with some of these topics. Like for instance, I don't need to go after Trudeau for minor mannerism, weird things.
Because he's effeminate? It's not necessary. No.
Yeah.
No, I agree.
Because I can talk policy and talk real consequential things that he has done, and moves he has made, decisions he has made, policies that he's implemented.
Yes.
To illustrate why I don't like him.
Yeah.
So like even a good example is I've seen clips before where one person posted a clip of Trudeau at a talk and he got up from his chair and he was wobbly and didn't look like he really had a good center of gravity on him. And people were being like, oh, look at Trudeau, he's obviously drunk or whatever. And if you watch the video in its full context, you can see that he was actually sitting in his effeminate manner, but it looks like when he stood up, his leg was just asleep.
Yeah.
And because within 30 seconds, that was done, and he wasn't wobbling anymore. He didn't look awkward on his feet because the blood rushed back to his leg.
Yeah.
But so that to me is just it mirrors this situation where it goes like, look, we should probably be paying attention to more important things.
The way I see a lot of this stuff is through this one filter. Is it a character attack, or are you attacking the right things, like the actual concept?
The ideas.
Yes, exactly. Like what are you working towards here? You and I poke fun at character the odd time because it's kind of funny, but I would never really use that as the foundation for my argument. Because if you're using a character attack as the foundation of your argument, it's because you don't have a good argument.
Right.
End of story.
Mm-hmm. All right, moving on to our next story. We've got Trump eyes February 1st start for 25% tariffs on Mexico and Canada. Former President Donald Trump announced plans to impose 25% tariffs on imports from Mexico and Canada starting February 1st, citing concerns over migration and fentanyl entering the U.S. Quote, we are thinking in terms of 25% on Mexico and Canada because they're allowing vast numbers of people to come in and fentanyl to come in, Trump stated. The move builds on Trump's 2024 campaign threats against Mexico, now expanding to include Canada and China. Critics warn tariffs could increase consumer costs, provoke retaliation, and disrupt industries reliant on trade with the U.S.'s top partners, raising questions about their economic and security impact. So, how will imposing 25% tariffs on Canada, one of America's closest allies and largest trading partners, strain economic ties and disrupt industries critical to both nations?
So it's kind of interesting, right? There's a lot of things that can happen here, and we talked about this last time. Kind of using the UFC as an analogy. I just want to clear something up. 170-pound category, not 175. I'm 175. This is why it's a comfortable thing to say, but I made the mistake. You were correct. Anyway, we use that as an example because we don't really know how this is going to shake out yet. But if you go ahead and say, okay, they throw on a 25% tariff, we can throw retaliatory tariffs at them. It will have some impact, but it will be minor because we have pigeonholed ourselves because we've refused to leverage our natural resources. So we are actually very dependent on the United States. This puts us in a vulnerable position. It's not an original idea. This is everywhere right now. Everybody kind of understands what's happening, right? So when you look at this, there's a few things that can happen. For starters, you can create a bad diplomatic issue between nations, between Mexico, between Canada and America. And, you kind of look at, what the long-term future looks like for our nations 10 years, 15 years from now, when the GDP globally begins to really decompress. You need to depend more on your close neighbors and allies. And we have a very strong integrated, I would say integrated economy, but integrated resources. We work well together, or we should work well together based on what we bring to the table. We are not doing our part right now, but we should work well together. So if this strains diplomatic ties, this may not be a good look for the future at a time when I think it's important that we get deeper into bed with each other, to be quite honest with you. And what's interesting too is, if you go far enough with this, like if you keep the tariffs up and you make it a big enough issue, the reality is, what does Mexico do? Well, they just leave their borders open then. They let more people in. They let more fentanyl in. They let more cartel in. Canada might do the same. So he may be opening himself up to a pretty big issue diplomatically, and and because it's really, from my understanding, it's against the sort of the foundation of the USMCA, our free trade agreement. I think it's going to piss off a lot of people. Now, when you think about it from an economic perspective, Canada is poised to drop 3 to 4% in GDP. This is a BMO report, I believe. And those are rough numbers. They figure it's going to take a few years to recover from this if something didn't get patched up. I don't really know what the impact of that is going to look like, other than seeing a massive increase in consumer pricing. That's what Canadians are going to face. You're going to pay more for everything because ultimately the consumers are going to take the hit, right? Now, one thing that's interesting is Trump's pushing on about this cheap energy initiative, right? However, if you cut off Canada, or if through this process you increase the cost of goods from Canada from the energy sector, how did that kind of works against his own initiatives? So it's interesting to see how this actually might backfire on him in a certain way. But I guess really only time will tell.
Yeah. So I think, to expand on one thing you just said there as well that I think is really important, is where I will critique Trump. Obviously I would prefer that these tariffs don't get put in place. They will cause havoc in Canada. But where I can really criticize it from his perspective, because I can make arguments in his shoes as to why he would want to implement those tariffs, stuff like, say, fentanyl trafficking and the illegal migration and border security and all of this kind of stuff. I do understand his argument for that. But where I think the critique lies is the fact that he hasn't been clear on what could be done to avoid that. You know what I mean? Like, so for instance, even if we start making moves now, which I agree we need to, even Luke Sabrin's interview has very much made that apparent as to the border issue and how much attention we should be putting that way and improvements we should be making, especially on the corruption front as well. But it's not clear as to be like, okay, say reduce it by 10%,
yes,
and I'll ease up on you this way, or get this done, and the threats are gone. It does seem like he's using it as a added negotiation tactic of maybe in his mind, as you've pointed out in a prior episode, that he just seems to be really on this idea of using tariffs as a way to economically stimulate America through revenue. But like, obviously that's going to have negative aspects, as you pointed out, with energy costs increasing in that type of thing. So I do wonder whether these tariffs were just going to be put in place no matter what we did, and this is just an excuse to allow them to continue going. Or who knows, maybe there is a way to actually diplomatically solve all of this, but that would be hopeful.
Yeah, I mean, I think he is, to what you were saying, I think the strategy here is about long-term economic independence and a more nationalistic perspective for America. I think that's his whole perspective here. I think that's his point. I think he was after President McKinley. We talked about this last time. He's kind of following in his footsteps. And I understand, like, there are things that you want to do domestic production for, and you want to drive Americans to do more manufacturing. You want to make your economy stronger, like after World War II. I totally get it. And the thing is, there are things in your market where you may be like, hey, we could produce a lot more of these. Right now, it's cost prohibitive. So if we put tariffs on these things coming in from other countries, this will stimulate domestic growth. So the theory is very sound. The problem is tariffs have become a form of economic warfare. You can't use these tools today as a lever on your neighbor and your ally without it seeming like economic warfare. So he's made up these excuses. Well, it's because of fentanyl in your border. Those are real problems, but like you said, there's no end in sight. What if they completely stop? Yeah, I don't think he's gonna dial back on them, because I think his agenda is actually adjacent to what he's saying. That's my big issue here. So you can't effectively use the tools you used 100 years ago because they mean different things today. If you don't, like, you look at the East and the West, you throw tariffs, everybody's throwing tariffs on Chinese EVs, everyone, everywhere in the West. That's what they're doing to basically help stimulate their own economies, keep them out of the market. They're saying, oh, well, Chinese subsidize, well, so do Canadians, so whatever. But anyway, these are their excuses. And everyone goes, yeah, that makes sense, good idea. But because that's the lens tariffs are viewed through, when you throw them on your neighbor, when you have a free trade agreement, this just looks like economic warfare. So I think this is going to be a big fight back and forth between any country he does this to that he's supposed to be allied with. So I'm not totally sure that this works out that well for him.
And I do think as well, we need to acknowledge that it's a two-way street. We just saw yesterday, Toronto police announced the $83 million cocaine bust, called the largest in the force's history.
Damn.
And that cocaine came from the, obviously, Sinaloa cartel, but it came from Mexico through America into Canada.
Right.
And so it's like, hey, this border issue goes both ways. And to your point, I would like it to be, okay, let's acknowledge ourselves as allies and diplomatically work on this problem together of fentanyl and cocaine distribution and illegal firearms, because all of our illegal, well, I shouldn't say all, but the vast majority, like over 90% of the illegal handguns in Canada are from America. So this is a two-way problem. But I do think, and this is, I wonder if this is the scenario. I've said before how I wonder whether Trump is using these tariffs as a way to pinch the Liberals out of office. And you do see that working in a sense right now, right? Because there's a lot of pressure on them to be, even the prorogation lawsuit hinges on the idea that we need to deal with these tariff threats.
Yes.
And so I do wonder if he's using these as well to say, push Trudeau out of office to say, get somebody more rational in that he will then maybe go, all right, now I'm willing to diplomatically sit at a table and work on this issue together and not be in a confrontation.
Yeah, I think that I would say that's like a minor component in a bigger plan, but I think it's part of it.
Hey everyone, we hope you're enjoying this episode. If so, please consider leaving us a kind review wherever you're listening. If even just a quarter of our weekly audience did so, we'd instantly become one of the top-rated Canadian podcasts. We appreciate you helping us out, and now back to the show. All right, moving on here. We've got Mark Carney officially announces he's running for Liberal leader. Mark Carney officially entered the Liberal leadership race in Edmonton, pledging plans over slogans. Ironically, his critique of slogans felt like one itself. The event was tightly controlled, with independent media banned and journalist Cian Bexty removed. Carney criticized Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre as a, quote, lifelong politician and took aim at Liberal spending, but offered few concrete policies, avoiding topics like the carbon tax. Positioning himself as an outsider despite advising Trudeau, Carney highlighted his economic crisis management experience, but faced criticism for his ties to Trudeau's unpopular carbon policies. So, given Mark Carney's ties to Trudeau's carbon policies and his background in elite circles, how can he convincingly present himself as a leader free from conflicts of interest and effectively unite a divided Canada under his vision?
Well, ultimately, he can't really do that, because any way you look at this guy, he's played a role in Trudeau's administration. He's responsible for a lot of the things that are happening today. He's championed the carbon tax and a lot of other economic issues that you've highlighted. So you can't really, and he runs in these elite circles. He's basically the institution with a nicer tie. Now, the question though was, how can he try to get this job done? Well, the only way he can do it is really by leveraging their control over the media. The Liberals control 70 to 80% of the media in Canada. They subsidize 70 to 80% of the media in Canada. Through Bill C-18, they subsidize a significant portion of independent media as well, to the tune of $67 million a year through Google. The other 33 is going to other mainstream channels. So they actually do control the narrative. And this is interesting. So a lot of people that I talk to that are a little older, they have an issue with Pierre Poilievre, but they can't tell you why. They really can't. They just spew nonsense. And you ask them for any particular reason, there's not one. Someone will say he's smug. Okay, cool, because you'll see him rip a CBC reporter apart for acting like a retard. But this is the perception that Canadians that only watch the mainstream media get of Pierre Poilievre. But if you watch him on any other forum, you're like, oh, he's very rational. He understands what's going on. He's going to fix, or at least try to fix, a lot of these things. If he implements the policy he's talking about the way he's talking about it, this is good. This is what Canada needs. It may not be the answer tomorrow, but he's the answer we need today. Cool. So, but you just look at, the reason I say this or use this example is because you look at how the media is able to manipulate the stories and the reality to make this guy look like the devil. He's evil. He's the problem. How is he the problem? All the issues we have, and there are a litany of them in this country, are all because of Liberal rule. They've been in power for 10 years. How can you possibly blame anyone else for this mess? It doesn't make any sense. But it's because they own the media. They can control these narratives. And this is why you'd see Trudeau always say these things online, in the media that you and I would watch online, but you'd watch it in the mainstream media, and you're like, that's just a full out lie. But I would go, oh, right, but this is the only story my parents are going to hear. So they're going to believe this one. And that's how they weaponize these things. And they're going to do the same thing with Carney. He's going to be new lifeblood in this Liberal Party. He's not. He's the old guard. The Liberal Party needs 10 to 12 years to just step down, rebuild, regroup, I think they can be a great party again. I've said this before, but they need fresh blood. They need patriots. They need people that aren't going to play this old institutional power and profit over the people game. And that's exactly what this guy is. So to your question again, the only way he can do it is by utilizing the media machine that they currently control through our tax dollars.
So one of the things that he highlighted, right, is his economic crisis management experience. But let's think about what that is a little bit more. That, you know, I would go as far as to say that his experience with economic crises is causing them. So it was just found in a recent U.S. House Judiciary report called Climate Control Exposing the Decarbonization Collusion in Environmental, Social, and Governance, or ESG investing. They highlighted what they called the climate cartel. So what this is financial institutions teamed up with climate activists in order to pressure corporations to implement net zero policies. So how they do this is they take the $130 trillion in assets that they have access under their umbrella. So it's institutional investors like BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street, CalPERS, which is the California pension. And so all of these big financial institutions and investors that wield billions upon billions, some of them trillions of dollars, team up in these financial alliances, which is called the Glasgow Financial Alliance. And also there's another one called Climate Action 100 Plus. And so what they agree to do is that anybody who doesn't implement the climate change agenda within their companies gets voted out. So they essentially they use their shareholder votes, because when you look at these companies, okay, you take the 15 biggest institutional investors, and then you literally look at every major corporation in at least the Western world, and these guys own like a good chunk of the top 10 shareholder positions that are all a part of this alliance. And so then they weaponize their shareholder votes to out people that don't implement the net zero agenda. But who's the one that is helping be the architect of this agenda is Mark Carney. And so Mark Carney is named 6 times in that report by the U.S. House Judiciary Committee. But what they found is that this financial alliance, and part of the policies that they implement in these companies, is that they want to limit supply of things like flights, fossil fuels, agriculture, and such like that to reduce the carbon emissions. But then on the back end, they raise prices so that they cover their ass because, okay, they call it demand management. So their idea is, well, we can't just we've realized that the whole green sustainable world technology stuff, like solar panels and wind farms, won't actually power the world. So we just need to force people to consume less in order to reduce emissions. And the way that they do that is by artificially driving up prices so people can't afford to consume as much. And so Mark Carney is completely gaslighting people when he says, oh, my experience in economic crisis management, because he is helping cause one.
So what I extrapolated from that, those well put, is that we all know there are men and women behind the curtain when it comes to Trudeau and these other governments, especially in the Western world. Carney's one of these guys.
Right.
Carney's one of the guys that is making life more unaffordable. He's making life worse for everybody. He's the person, one of the people that is implementing these agendas in the Western world that we sit there and blame Trudeau for, but no, he's not that bright. He's one of those guys. He's the wizard behind the curtain, and he's now going to run this country for the next 6-8 months. We're in some serious shit. Because I'm pretty sure he's going to win. He's got a lot of support. I don't see Freeland having a really good chance.
Yeah. So one of his titles was the UN Special Envoy for Climate Action and Finance. So what he would do is work at organizations like the UN and the WEF, because he also helped author their financial reforms. And so when we see guys like Trudeau being called a young global leader with this whole World Economic Forum organization and such, is yes, you have guys like Mark Carney who are creating the policy like carbon tax and such, and even again this demand management and all of these kind of policies and ideas, and then he helps create them at the UN and the WEF, and then all of these leaders like that you see around the world that are all on board with this, whether it's Trudeau or whether it's Starmer or whether it's the German chancellor who was just at Davos this week,
Olaf,
all of them, then they all go and take these policies that are created at the UN and the WEF and they start implementing them in their respective countries.
Yes.
And so, yes, Carney is, you know, if Trudeau gets criticized as being one of the guys that, you know, is a mouthpiece for these international organizations like the UN and WEF, then you can think of Carney as the one writing those script points.
He's the mastermind or one of the masterminds behind this. They're all a bunch of crooks. Jesus.
And I think this is so important to note as to this is completely unprecedented in Canadian history as well, because the last situation that would have been anything similar to this would have been the Kim Campbell scenario when Brian Mulroney was forced to step down, or he
resigned in 1993.
He resigned. And then the party had to elect a new leader of the Progressive Conservative Party, and they elected Kim Campbell, who then was the Prime Minister of Canada for 6 months?
Not even. It was June to November.
Right.
Just about
until
6
the
months.
next election. So it's very a lot of people are making the comparison to Kim Campbell when it comes to this whole Liberal leadership race.
I'm the one been doing that. From day one, I'm like, they're going to Kim Campbell one of these people. That's exactly what's going to happen.
This is what is crazy, and it's so wild. It's such a gap in our parliamentary and our political system, which is that Mark Carney has never been elected into public office in Canada. So you have, because the way it usually works is you have people within these parties, like Kim Campbell was an MP.
Yes.
So she at least had to win in a local riding.
Yes.
And then she also was the leader of the Conservative Party, which made her the Prime Minister. Mark Carney is not an MP. He's not a member of parliament.
And you have never served in government like that. Yes.
So you have somebody walking straight out of central banking and international organizations into the leadership role of Canada.
Yeah, this is actually a really big problem. So I think our parliamentary system is pretty good by comparison to the rest of the world. It's I don't love a lot of it, but it's top notch by comparison. One of my big issues, of course, is the Senate, which I think should be elected. Otherwise, this is a huge gap in our arsenal, right? Because think about it like this. We know we've had our elections compromised by China. We also know India and Iran are involved. So we know that there's multiple countries infiltrating our elections. And even Hogue, the Hogue Commission right now, they've said, well, they didn't change the election outcome, but they definitely changed some ridings. I don't know how you can have one without the other. I think that's bullshit. If you change some ridings, then you could have changed the outcome of the entire election. So we know, I don't mean to pick on the Chinese, but we'll do it for argument's sake right now.
Actually, sorry, just to build on that really quickly. Also, too, when you think about it in votes, well, okay, in Parliament, when you're actually voting on bills, well, if this party had 5 more seats and that party had 5 less, though, that kind of thing can make a big difference in just parliamentary function for the next 4 years.
Well, yeah, that's exactly what I'm saying. Is you can't say it all affected these races, but didn't affect things overall. Right. It doesn't make any sense, especially considering it's you're not done yet and it's relatively inconclusive. But anyway, yeah, sorry. So you think about this, right? You go, okay, well, China definitely compromised our elections. And what was interesting is when Trudeau pulled the last election. He was like, okay, well, I'm going to win a majority. I've got a minority. I'm going to win a majority. That's why he did this. The only reason people do it in politics is because they think they can get a stronger stance within their current situation, right? So I'm sorry. So the only reason they're going to pull an election is because they think that they can improve their standings. So he's like, okay, I have a minority. I'm going to win a majority. And I know this was sort of back channel information, but from what came out was that China wanted the Liberals to win a minority. But Trudeau had enough Trudeau should have had enough information to go, I'm going to win a majority. I've got enough polling. I see enough data. Yeah, I can do this. Okay, let's pull an election. Let's go. Otherwise, he wouldn't have done it. However, he still won a minority. So I don't know how much control they have, and I can't necessarily corroborate the back channel information, but he did think he was going to win a majority and won a minority. So my point is, China's got a reasonable amount of sway over our elections. So what would stop them from now having implemented someone literally from the CCP to come in and run our country because of this gap in our parliamentary arsenal? This is ridiculous. It's got to be closed. You can't do this. This is dumb. So I don't know what they're going to do about it. Hopefully the next leader after this guy, because Carney's obviously not going to close this loop. Hopefully it's Poilievre. Hopefully they start closing up some of these loops, because this is a huge problem. And don't get me wrong, that was a little hyperbolic. I totally understand that.
But in theory, it could happen.
Exactly. That's my point. And that's the big issue we got here.
Yeah, it's unlikely to happen, but the fact that it is possible under certain circumstances is a problem in and of itself.
Exactly.
All right, moving on to our next story. We've got Chrystia Freeland's authoritarian overreach during the Freedom Convoy exposed. Tamara Litch, a Freedom Convoy organizer, revealed Chrystia Freeland's handwritten notes from early 2022, exposing her mindset during the Emergency Act invocation. Freeland wrote, quote, "There has to be a new definition of privacy, hinting at a willingness to redefine basic rights." Another note directed banks to target, quote, "mischief makers," leading to arbitrary account freezes that left ordinary Canadians unable to access their money. Freeland deemed these measures as a success, stating, quote, "This account freeze initiative actually was successful." Her notes also suggest extreme measures such as, quote, "use military at the borders," and, quote, "designating this group as a terrorist group." In 2023, the federal court ruled the invocation unconstitutional, stating the government's actions were disproportionate and failed to respect the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Freeland's actions demonstrate a readiness to suppress dissent through authoritarian means, raising serious concerns about her suitability for leadership. So is Chrystia Freeland better suited to be in the Liberal Party leadership race or on criminal trial?
Yeah, I mean, here's the issue you have. She should definitely be on trial for these kinds of things. That's undermining democracy in a very significant way. When you talk about using military, force like that, when you talk about designating these groups as terrorists, they've done nothing to deserve that. You've mentioned this before, that when they were in Ottawa for the Freedom Convoy, the crime rate went down. It's literally the opposite of terrorism. So it doesn't really make any sense. These people just don't like that there are people that oppose them. So this is all about their ideology. And they're willing to weaponize all the tools that they have and basically remove the process of democracy to suit their needs if you push back against what they're saying. This is very dangerous. These are very dangerous people. I go back to my previous point. Because the people in charge make the rules, they built a system that protects them. So we have this issue where you and I think we live in a democracy, but do we really? And that's a very reasonable question. I have this theory called the democracy dilemma, which we've talked on here before, about wondering whether or not democracy's been completely compromised. And I think we've got the next 4 to 5 years in Canada and the next 4 years in America to see if it is. If Poilievre can't move the needle back in the right direction, and if Trump can't move the needle back in the right direction, I would suggest that democracy is completely compromised. And the way that our society operates today is no longer beneficial, efficient, pick your word, it doesn't matter. Now, when it comes to Freeland specifically, these kinds of things should bury someone in politics, right? Like, this is the interesting thing that we face today that gives the other side in the argument the benefit as well. And what I mean by that is, when Trump got into politics, he opened up a whole new world of politics, of name calling, of character attacks, of basically popularity contests, which have always kind of been there, but not to this degree. So he opened up what's acceptable. You don't have to be as educated anymore, which I think is positive. So there's a lot of new things that are allowed within politics, right? Because back in the day, like, if you just cheated on your wife, you were out. Like, there was no chance. You had to be squeaky clean and go to Harvard and all these other things, right? Everything, your taxes, everything have to be bang on 100%. So I don't think you're going to find perfect people to do these jobs, because they're dirty jobs to begin with. So I think that was a bit of a broken old system. However, now you can get away with smoking crack like Ford did when he was the mayor of Toronto, So you think, you're like, okay, so this is it's gotten a lot wider, right? I think that's what's happened today. So, we've got a new system that allows them to do things that are not great for society, and still kind of operate in the political space, which I don't think is necessarily bad. But you're seeing that now work against us, because while she's been in power, she tried to basically end democracy in a sense. That's a little hyperbolic, but you know what I mean.
Well, she said, she would argue that she was doing it to protect democracy, right? And this is where I think the Orwellian concept of doublethink, and also just words having double meanings. So, for instance, there's one meaning for when they use it in propaganda into the rest of the world. So they say, save our democracy, the image they're trying to project to you is that you have power over this system, right? That's what democracy is. You get to vote, and this guy is a threat to that. But then there's also a inner party meaning for the word democracy as well. And so in Orwellian concepts, the famous motto was always war is peace, freedom is slavery, ignorance is strength, right? It's not that they'd say that outwardly. It's just that when the party said freedom, they meant slavery. Same thing here. When they say democracy, what they really mean is the concept we've talked about, which is managed democracy.
Yes.
So yes, you get to vote and we want you to have a say, but you get a vote between WEF leaders of Mark Carney, Chrystia, Freeland, and Justin Trudeau. That's democracy. Democracy isn't you going and actually having something outside of that window. And actually, even, we talked about the German chancellor there for a minute. Another good example of this is like when he said, yeah, we definitely believe in freedom of speech and Germany respects freedom of speech, but freedom of speech does not apply to far right extremism. And you go, wait, no, that's exactly what freedom of speech means, is that you, the government, don't get to decide what is extremist or whatever. In a proper scenario like this, you would like to think that the institutions work properly and that it does actually go ground up accountability level, but it's the exact opposite. In this, her notes perfectly point that out, because at one point when she says we need to designate this group as a terrorist group, right in those notes as well, she was directing what she was saying towards David, who she wouldn't admit in this hearing who it was. She tried to be like, "Oh, I don't know who David is," kind of like the two Randys scenario.
Never heard of him.
Never heard of him. But there's a lot of speculation that who she was mentioning in that point was David Vigneault, who was the head of CSIS at the time. So she is saying, David, we need you to designate this. Give us something to designate this group as a terrorist group, because the way that it should work in a democracy is whatever, you have the elected leaders and you have these institutions, and let's say CSIS on the side had independently done their own investigation, and let's just, for instance, say there was actually terrorism in this scenario, even although, as you pointed out, that's obviously not the case when it comes to the Freedom Convoy. But had it worked properly, CSIS would have had their own evidence and then came to the politicians and said, hey, guys, we have found this issue and we think we should act on it in this way, do so accordingly, blah, blah, blah. But as you're seeing here, the same people that say, we want to protect democracy by doing all of these authoritarian measures are really going to those institutions and being like, hey, give us something so that we can label them.
Yeah, they're weaponizing our intelligence agency against us so that they can enforce their will.
Yeah.
Very dangerous.
All right, moving on to our next story. We've got Canada's EV mandate faces a reality check as subsidies disappear. Transport Canada has ended its $5,000 EV subsidy program due to depleted funds, with Quebec also suspending its $7,000 subsidy. EVs averaging $82,000 remain unaffordable without rebates, undermining the 2035 electrification goal. Infrastructure is also insufficient, with 30,000 public chargers versus a need for 430,000, and a strained electrical grid requiring $1.7 trillion to expand capacity by 50%. Additionally, EV production has environmental costs, including resource-intensive battery mining and increased road wear. The mandate is an economic and logistical failure, demanding a revaluation of sustainable transportation policies. So, how much longer will the Canadian government cling to the delusion that gas-powered cars can be outlawed? Because again, important context here, the federal government of Canada has outlawed the sale of gas-powered cars as of 2035.
When's the next election?
Yeah.
That's all it's going to take, buddy. That's it. This is wild.
Yeah.
I could almost just reread the statements you made. You look at You remove the subsidies because you shouldn't be spending tax dollars on that anyway. That's just stupid because all they do is increase the price of EVs. As you see now, the average price is $82,000. Doesn't make any sense. I was going to mention the electricity grid. If you didn't, I was like, it's wild. The infrastructure improvements required to do this are fucking bananas, and they want us to use green energy. Are you mental? This doesn't make any sense whatsoever. And it's hilarious that you've got 30,000 public chargers. You know how many billions of dollars have gone to public chargers? Billions and billions and billions. They're just doing nothing with this money except lighting it on fire. Way to go, government efficiency. So this is all pretty much, this is standard. The nice thing is when government in general, but really the Liberals over the last 10 years for sure, but when government in general rolls out these programs, really of any kind, they're gonna mess it up. It's not gonna go well. So even though we sit here and we have to bitch and complain about how insane they are, we kind of know they're gonna cock it up. So it's all right in the long run. So this is gone as soon as Poilievre's in. They're getting rid of it in the States already because it doesn't really make any sense. We already know that the increased value or the decrease in their carbon footprint is like 26, 27% for an EV over the life cycle of a vehicle versus gas. So it's not a silver bullet solution. We've known all this for a very, very long time. So this is just a bunch of nonsense, and it looks like it's going to go by the wayside, I would say, within the next year or so. What's challenging, though, and I hope they can repurpose these things, is the $10 to $12 billion we've invested in foreign companies. One, Northvolt, which I think has now gone under, which is insane, in Canada to build battery plants for these EVs. So I hope we find a way to sort of rework the situation so that's not a complete loss. I've already written it off mentally, but I hope we sort of find our way through that.
Just think about what our electricity grid capacity has grown by over the last, say, 20 years. Pretty much our year-over-year rate for the grid capacity growth has been somewhere in the neighborhood of 1.5 to 2.5%.
Wow.
So you're looking at a minimum of 25 years to grow that capacity. And also when you just look at the trajectory of Canada, like, so for instance, if we look at something like housing, we're building as much houses as we have in the 1970s. So just our general productivity rate is declining
significantly,
especially when you consider that we have more people than we did then as well. But this just goes to show across sectors, we're just becoming less and less productive. Actually, the OECD pegged us as going to be the least productive advanced economy for the next 4 decades straight.
That's a bit of a bold forecast, but holy shit.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just hard to look that far down the road and say that because of our natural resources and how we can turn and pivot on things, but still.
Right.
Like, all I'm saying is, hey, Canada, that sounds like a pretty
I'm
dark
not saying
stat.
Things couldn't change.
Yeah, but that's
if
wild.
You look at it, this is their idea, is that for our goal, that even if we were to best case scenario, it would take us 25 years to meet the electric grid capacity.
Yeah, for sure.
But we have a mandate for this to happen in 10 years.
Yes.
But also, if you look at just the trajectory of the nation, nothing has been showing us that we're up to that task.
No, and I think, what I would say too is, like, you want to increase the grid by 50%, which means you have to increase our energy supply by 50%, except you want this to be green energy. Where are you getting it from?
Right.
How are you doing it? We don't have the capacity. We don't have the science. We don't have the tech.
Actually,
and then you have to implement all of that as well. There's just zero chance of this making any sense.
Actually, it's a funny little thing I just noticed here as well, is that up until 2015, we were growing, about between 2 to 2.5% annually, our grid capacity. But actually, after Trudeau took office, it went from it started slowly declining from 1.98% in his first year to 1.77% in his last year. So it's been steadily declining the capacity of the grid, the rate at which we expand our grid has been declining since he took office.
Yeah, and I think there's also something else to be said about this whole charger issue. I know this is this may be a bit of a stretch for some people, but if you've ever been in a Tesla or an electric vehicle, you get this weird feeling like, oh no, where's the next gas station?
Right.
Because you can't just fill up. And so I was listening to a podcast between Theo Vaughn and Joe Rogan the other day, and Theo's driving a Cybertruck, and he's hilarious. I just thought he's so funny. So he was talking, but I'll kind of cut to the chase here. He was traveling around different parts of America to go see his mom, and he gets stuck in the hood for 2 hours to charge his vehicle enough to get out of there. Now, it's Theo Vaughn. He's not in any danger. It's jokes. But you see what I mean? Like, this is common. It's like some places you'll go, and he's like, yeah, I was getting 2 miles an hour on the recharge because he was charging at his buddy's house. And you kind of go like, this is not an efficient system. There's no wonder. The reason I'm mentioning this is because of adoption today. I wouldn't buy an EV. Well, I'm a car guy, and I like traditional vehicles, and I like to feel the power of them, and I like shifting gears. I like that kind of thing, and it's whatever for some people. So, but I don't think electric vehicles are a bad option. I think they can exist in the market. I think they're reasonable, but a lot of people don't want to enter the market today because of what I'm talking about. If you travel or do anything, or you plan on going places like that, unless you just go from home to work, to the gym, to the grocery store, and that's it, that's your everyday, and you can just plug in your car, you get this weird feeling of scarcity because you can't just go fill up somewhere, and it takes X amount of time. Even the superchargers still take 20, 45 minutes to fill up. So it's just not a good system right now. And what's interesting too, and I don't know how long this is going to take to commercialize, but BMW has leaped over the EV need. They're in hydrogen now, which is a much better technology. The challenge with hydrogen is converting water into hydrogen. Because water is such a stable molecule, it is a very energy intense process to convert and pull out just hydrogen. So it's a bit of and obviously hydrogen bombs are wild. So you also have to consider that. I mean, I'm a little out of my depth when I get into that realm. But anyway, they seem to have found a really, really good way of doing this or utilizing this technology. So we're already moving on to something else that is actually going to be more beneficial anyway. I think that we should be focusing more on, maybe the scientific advancement of these problems and not implementing a really bad solution. It's just that the liberals they're hogtied, right? They committed to this so deeply and threw so many billions at it that they just can't go back the other way, but it'll get flipped in a year.
Well, just to kind of circle this around back to the original question of how long will they hold on to this delusion, I think we can also take into factor what I was talking about with Mark Carney and the demand management aspect, right? Is let's look at what they would consider wins and losses when it comes to EV driving. As they go, best case scenario, our plans work magically and we live in an electric utopia and everyone has an electric car and that's great. A middle ground scenario, which isn't as much of a win, but is still a win for them, is that, well, you know what? No, we don't actually have enough EVs and infrastructure for everybody to have one, but at least they're not driving gas-powered cars anymore, so the emissions are down. Because again, that's their end goal. That's their highest value is, well, we like the end justifies the means,
yes.
Right? People not having cars is justified if it reduces our emissions. And so to them, I don't even think it's a big loss. And that's why I think they would be willing to hold on to this delusion, because even if the plan of everyone having one doesn't work out, it's still a win in their books because they get the goal of having the emissions reduced.
Yeah, actually, that's a good point. I should say that they are actually hogtied to their climate agenda more so than just the EVs. This is just one of their quote unquote silver bullet solutions.
Right.
Yes.
All right, moving on to our last story for the day. We've got judge agrees to expedite legal challenge of Trudeau's move to prorogue Parliament. The federal court has granted an expedited hearing for a legal challenge against Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's 11-week prorogation of Parliament, announced after his agreement to step down as Prime Minister. This move coincides with President Donald Trump's plans to impose a 25% tariff on imports and threats of using economic force to annex Canada. Applicants David McKinnon and Eris Lavranos argue that the prorogation undermines democracy and Parliament's ability to respond to these crises. Chief Justice Paul Crampton emphasized the urgency, setting the hearing for February 13th to 14th with potential implications for executive power and Canada's trade policy response. So, should Trudeau have the power to prorogue Parliament during a crisis, effectively silencing democratic response to threats against Canada's sovereignty?
So I did a bit of research on where the power to prorogue government even came from, because it was a little hazy to me. Like, I understood what it was, but why and where. So
actually, why don't we just quick break down what it is again before we get into this topic, what a prorogation is?
Yeah, so proroguing government is essentially shutting it down effectively so it does not operate for a set amount of time for what is supposed to be a specific reason to enhance governance, not obstruct it. So that's what prorogation was supposed to be. And so the power to prorogue government in Canada is rooted in its constitutional framework and parliamentary system inherited from the British model. So historically, it was a tool that would be used to allow government to refocus their legislative priorities, signal the end of one legislative session and prepare for the next, and provide a break in parliamentary business when required. That's the intention of why it exists. However, now it's just used to avoid getting in trouble and avoid accountability. So there's a couple things that I would say. You said, should he have the power? First of all, you should need a majority to prorogue government. So if you don't get one other party to say, yes, let's go on a pause, you don't get to. Because the only reason Trudeau did this is because he was about to lose his position. There was going to be a vote of non-confidence, and Liberals and him, they were gone. That was what was going to happen. So he prorogued government. This has nothing to do none of this in any way benefits society. This only benefits him and his party. So for me, I don't think they should have this power unless it meets a specific criteria. And I also think you should need majority to actually prorogue government. Like, it should be a vote.
Yeah, and I think one of these things is that, you know, people will constantly point to, say, the Trudeau defenders, which is an insane concept to even think about that they exist. Trudeau defenders online and stuff will often point to the fact that Stephen Harper prorogued government 4 times. Now, 2 of those times were in a similar manner. Obviously, the stakes were not as high back then, but he was using it for personal power reasons. He wanted to avoid a non-confidence in one, and there was also an investigation into a decision that his government had made in response to Afghani detainees that he wanted to block accountability into, essentially. But the other 2 that he did, because he did 4 prorogations, the other 2 were standard routine, because one of the uses of it is, okay, once essentially our legislative agenda, the bills we wanted to pass go through, you go through this prorogation parliament where you wipe parliament clean and you say, when we come back after this recess of the allotted period of time, we're starting a new agenda, a new direction, essentially, right? So twice he used it. But what bothers me in that scenario is, it's like, okay, so what's your scenario? What are you trying to argue here? That just because Harper abused it, and like, sure, I'll acknowledge that I'm now supposed to accept that Trudeau is abusing it? Like, it makes absolutely no sense. So to me, just like I think we need to close the hole on the whole being able to just shoehorn a unelected person into the prime minister's office, I think that's a major hole that needs to be closed. But also, I think we need to close this hole of using things like prorogation to avoid accountability during a major crisis.
Yeah, I think what happens is some people don't realize that people like you and I just don't want there to be bad people in government and bad rules to support them. It's not about who gets to use them. We don't want anybody to have these tools. It's not about wanting the conservatives or the liberals to have it or not have it. It's just that no matter what, these tools eventually work against us. No matter what, because when you give them these weapons, whoever's in charge will use them to their benefit. And this is the problem. And I know some of these are historical and some of these are relatively new, like the censorship laws that they're implementing. But it really doesn't matter how you shake it out. Eventually, these will be used against every single person in Canada, depending which party's in power. And our whole thing is, we don't want anybody to have these. And I know some of these things have been around for a while, but a lot has come up in the last few years, especially since the pandemic, with how much more now people are paying to, how much more attention people are paying to politics and everything like this. And I think a lot of these things need to be overhauled. And I think this should be, another one that's close to the top of the list, because our sovereignty is actually in jeopardy now, because Trump is talking not only about 25% tariffs, but about economic annexation, using economic tools to annex Canada right now. So it's preposterous that we can have our government on hold because some guy doesn't want to lose his spot.
Yeah. And just to build on that part that you were saying there about kind of our philosophy towards government is, I think most people, and this is actually Theodore Kaczynski made a great argument in response to that. Side note, that's the Unabomber.
Is it the first time we brought it up in the podcast?
I think so.
Nice.
So he's a funny person to quote, but he made a very good point one time about how he made a critique back in like 80s or 90s about how the leftists, how they positioned themselves as against the establishment. However, he said, in this, because his whole thing was he wanted to overthrow the industrial world.
Yes.
He didn't like the progress of technology. He thought that technology was going to lead to the enslavement of humanity. But so he said in his whole manifesto, you can't trust the leftists because while they position themselves as critiques of the establishment, they're only critiquing power so that they can implement themselves into it. that they don't actually want to dismantle the power system. They just want to be in charge of it. And I think that's a spot on analysis, but also that's just across a lot of the stuff that you see now, because even I do start seeing it. You can even start seeing it in, say, some of the more radical Trump supporters, that they now want him to use the government full force for what they want him to do. But I feel like both you and I are on the side where it's like, I look at power in and of itself, which the government is literally the power center. They're the only institution that is allowed to operate through force. Like, if you don't do what we say, we're going to throw you in jail.
Yes.
So they are force legitimized, but that's why I just want there to be is like the power center to be decentralized and to not have as much power in that section, no matter who is in charge of it.
Yes.
And so I think, that is when we start going through this transition, because whether if Trudeau can, stay in power a little bit longer, make sure that he hands the baton to another liberal insider, etc. I hope that at least we can remain with that same mindset when people like Poilievre get into power, where we continually push on those power centers and try to hold them accountable, that the attitude in Canada doesn't just become, okay, now let's get revenge.
Yeah, I mean, it was interesting what Poilievre said in that video. He did say the government should just stay out of it. He did say that. He said that a lot. He's been really on about that. And, it's interesting because we're at this point right now in Canada's history where the government has had significant overreach. So there's a good argument to make that it should be significantly reduced. But also they've grown so much that they're our biggest burden economically. So there's another reason why they should be reduced, right? So there's all these things that are happening that are kind of making this perfect storm to be like, hey, let's cut this bitch down by 80%. And this is like, I think a way of summing up what you're saying essentially is we're libertarian.
Right.
These institutions should have much less power and the people should have the power. Bottom line.
All right. Before we get out of here, don't forget to head over to our Substack where you can find our... All right, before we get out of here, don't forget to head over to our Substack where you can sign up for our newsletter, which goes out 5 days a week, completely free. Thanks for watching, and we'll catch you next time.
Bye, everybody.